from their communities and places it in the hands of politicians. The Indian Act hands over all reserve land and money to the federal government. This means that First Nations have to go through Ottawa to ask for their tax revenues collected from resource projects on their land. This outdated system puts power in the hands of bureaucrats, politicians, and lobbyists, not First Nations. The direct result of this Ottawa knows best approach has been poverty, substandard infrastructure and housing, unsafe drinking water, and despair. Conservatives have listened to First Nations, and we have announced support for an optional First Nations resource charge that enables First Nations to take back control of their resources and their money. This is a First Nations-led solution to a made-in-Ottawa problem. First Nations and the First Nations Tax Commission developed the plan, and they brought it to Conservatives, and we accepted. This new optional model will simplify negotiations between resource companies and First Nations. The FNRC will not preclude any community from continuing to use other existing arrangements, such as impact benefit agreements. I am committed. I want to quote our leader in his conversation with them. He said, "The First Nations resource charge cedes federal tax room so communities will no longer need to send all their revenues to Ottawa and then ask for it back. It will also make resource projects more attractive to First Nations, so they are more likely to go ahead." And then he said,
I know he was trying to raise a point of order. The Sergeant of Arms has already went out. He just went out to take care of that.
Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Yeah.
2 rows down from the Honourable Member.
Yeah. Yes, and
she's delivering what I think is very appropriate.
Yeah, and it's not that we haven't been on top of it. There is, they were taking care of it. The Honourable Member for Yorkton Millville.
"Can you tell me then how much time I have left, please? Perhaps I will try to."
The Honourable Member has 6 minutes left.
Okay. Well, in light of what's been going on, I would like to go back to where I indicated that First Nations do not want to be stakeholders, they want to be shareholders. And I ended that conversation back in October of 2023 by saying I look forward to that day with them. And I had an awful lot of very positive responses to that comment. And at that time, I had no idea that 3.5 months later, an announcement would be made that provides a clear map to a better future laid out by First Nations for First Nations, for reconciliation, forgiveness, healing, and for our shared nation of Canada. On February 8th, 2024, the Honourable Leader of Canada's Common Sense Conservatives committed to enable First Nations to take back control of their resource revenues from big government gatekeepers in Ottawa. Speaker, for hundreds of years, First Nations have suffered under a broken colonial system that takes power away from their communities and places it in the hands of politicians in Ottawa. The Indian Act hands over all reserve land money to the federal government. This means that First Nations have to go to Ottawa to ask for their tax revenues collected from resource projects on their land. This outdated system puts power in the hands of bureaucrats, politicians, and lobbyists, not First Nations. The direct result of this Ottawa knows best approach has been poverty, substandard infrastructure and housing, unsafe drinking water, and despair. Conservatives have listened to First Nations, and we have announced support for an optional First Nations resource charge that enables First Nations to take back control of their resources and money. This is a First Nations-led solution to a made-in-Ottawa problem. First Nations and the First Nations Tax Commission developed the plan. They brought it to Conservatives, and we accepted. This new optional model will simplify negotiations between resource companies and First Nations. The FNRC will not preclude any community from continuing to use other existing agreements, such as impact benefit agreements. First Nations can choose the FNRC to replace the financial component in impact benefit agreements or supplement IBAs as they wish. The FNRC will respect all treaty rights and all constitutional rights, including the duty to consult. Putting First Nations back in control of their money and letting them bring home the benefits of their resources will help get local buy-in for good projects to go ahead. In other words, more earnings for grassroots First Nations communities, not Ottawa gatekeepers. Those earnings will mean paychecks, schools, and clean water for people. The leader of the Conservative Party of Canada said this, and I'm going to quote him at this point. The First Nations resource charge cedes federal tax room, so communities will no longer need to send all their revenues to Ottawa and then ask for it back. It will also make resource projects more attractive to First Nations, so they are more likely to go ahead. He says, I am committed to repealing the liberal, radical anti-resource laws to quickly greenlight good projects so First Nations and all Canadians bring home more powerful paychecks, end quote. Madam Speaker, when we talk about axing the tax, building the homes, fixing the budget, and stopping crime, that promise, although it's just the tip of the iceberg that you're hearing about today, is a promise to every possible Canadian that lives in this country and every person that is calling it home. We are excited about what we have the opportunity to do here with First Nations and are especially thrilled that they have come up with this situation to solve some of the frustrations that they experience, knowing that they have so much more opportunity now to succeed as every other Canadian and every other Canadian organization or group or people have to succeed. So, Madam Speaker, I am so pleased that we, as common sense Conservatives, are fighting for real economic reconciliation by supporting First Nations, taking back control of their money and their lives. It's my home. It's your home. It's our home. Let's bring it home together. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions and comments? The Honourable from Nepean.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I thank the honourable member for her speech. I was born in a country which was a colony of foreign rulers for hundreds of centuries, and I appreciate the multi-generational trauma the people had to face. I am happy to note that she mentioned the word unity that we should use when we talk about diversity. And interestingly, her comment about using the word shareholders instead of stakeholders, I would like to ask her to explain whether her reason for using the word shareholders is that because the resources, the returns that is generated can be equitably distributed amongst the Indigenous people.
The honourable member for Yorkton Melville.
Well, I thank the member very much for that question. The difference between stakeholders and shareholders was expressed to me by Indigenous peoples because that they feel they are on the outside looking in so often with the government where they are somewhat being consulted and they go like this. But it's not about consultation. It's about being part of the process and being included because they are shareholders. They are a shareholder in what is happening in Canada as much as anyone else, and they have that added pressure because of past circumstances that they have experienced in feeling that they are not being given that due attention. And so that's why, as a Conservative, with the opportunity that our leader had to meet with them, to be asked to come and meet, to hear their plan and their excitement about the potential for their futures and taking responsibility for what is truly theirs was very exciting for me to hear. And I'm also so thrilled to know that in Canada, we all have the opportunity to succeed. That's our goal on this side of the floor when we become government.
And comments? L'honorable député de Laurentides-Labelle.
The honourable member for Laurentides-Labelle. Thank you, Madam Speaker. Considering what we know from the final report by Amnesty International, which was entitled Enough Stolen Lives. I'd like my colleague to explain how the government is ignoring that and how finally progress was made when the commission, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, found that women and Aboriginal, Indigenous women and girls experienced disproportionate violence.
I think in general, and I am being general at this point in answering the member's question, women do face disproportional violence in every segment of our society, which needs to change. And I think what frustrates me the most is that this government is picking and choosing where and how that might take place. And then in other situations, as an example, when a woman who is pregnant faces an attack by a third party and she is injured, or the life inside of her is injured or killed, this government chose to ignore doing something that we could do, and that was to bring in a requirement of recognition of that by the judge who is in the process of sentencing. So we're not even talking about determining whether or not there was a crime committed. That's already been determined. And yet they chose not to respond to that opportunity. And there are a number of them that I would like to speak to, but I believe we agree that women in this country and around the world should be protected from violence far more than they are.
Comments? The Honourable Member for Edmonton Strathcona.
I'd like to thank my colleague from Saskatchewan for her intervention today. Part of this legislation is a clause that justifies past discrimination and violation of human rights. It allows the government to have discriminated without impunity and underscores the sense of colonial entitlement. So I'm wondering if the member agrees with the provision of the legislation that prohibits First Nation women from seeking compensation for historic harms. Is it justified that this government denied First Nations women access to health care, education, or safe housing? I think I know the answer, but I'd like to hear from her, please.
Honourable Member for Yorkton Melville.
Yeah, well, obviously I disagree with that in there. And part of the reason I went through a little bit of a historical comment there from one year to the other was, for me, just indicated how incremental government can be in dealing with issues and problems when really the whole thing could have been dealt with substantially. And that's why I'm excited about what First Nations have brought to the Conservative Party and asked us to be partnered with them to make sure that a lot of those circumstances from the past are nullified going forward for their women and their girls and for their nations. And so that's why, as I mentioned, I spoke to the history, and I'm also speaking to the wonderful future that I believe our First Nations have here in Canada with the decisions that they are making and we are encouraging.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for South Okanagan, Similkameen Nicola.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I certainly appreciate this member's intervention on this important debate on C-38. I think that obviously there are a number of inequities that existed after various governments have brought forward legislation, and that has unfortunately hit upon many of the individuals that this legislation tries to target. I know that this particular member has worked very hard with Indigenous leaders, community members, individuals in her riding and probably throughout her region. I'd just like to ask to see if she could comment on some of the things, positive things that she's seen, and also maybe remark on some of the other inequities that she believes needs to be addressed by a future government.
Yeah, and I'll apologize to the Honourable Member. I said South Okanagan, I meant Central Okanagan. The Honourable Member for Yorkton Melville.
Well, I thank my colleague for that question. I have to say, with my role as the Member of Parliament for Yorkton Melville, this is one of the highlights of my personal experience because it has opened me up to a lot more relationships within the Indigenous communities in my riding and within the province as well. And, you know, I can say even for myself, it has taken hard work on both sides to build that relationship up. And you can't really succeed at anything if you don't have that relationship. So I did have the opportunity when we did our Sask Caucus retreat. We do it every winter, every summer, and get together with various groups and individuals who want to meet with us. And I had reached out to Chief O'Soup, who is the chief of the Yorkton Tribal Council to see if we could come and visit. And she said yes, and so it did happen, but I can tell you that she came to me, she said, Kathy, like, we've never done this before. We're not sure what we're getting into here. Well, you know what? We showed up a little late because we had another meeting, and we sat down. The first thing we did was had soup and bannock and start talking, finding out that our senator had gone to school with one of these individuals. And then built over that time together, a realization that we could then talk about some pretty serious circumstances going on in our communities. So I see that the speaker's saying I need to end now, but I just want to thank you for the time to be able to say there's a lot of good things going on, and it's at the initiative of our First Nations wanting to work with their communities in reconciliation.
Honorable député Châteauguay-Lacolle.
The honourable member for Châteauguay-Lacolle.
I listened to the member's speech, and I appreciate that she is, especially in her riding, that she's building those relationships. But she said early on in her speech, and she's repeated it again, our First Nations, and she said something to justify why she uses that term. Which I find a little bit disconcerting, because it's certainly not the way that I would refer to Ganawage, which is the neighboring reserve to my riding. So I'd like to hear the member more on that, why she says that, and why she said that diversity is not a strength.
Order. I'm sure that the honourable member can answer the questions that are being asked of her. I don't think she needs any help from her colleagues. The honourable member for Yorkton Melvin has 1 minute to respond.
Okay, thank you for the question, because I know it's out there. Listen, I refuse to succumb to wokeness and to people telling me what I am defining with the words that I use. I used to coach teams. I would say our team. These are our children. These are our friends. I refuse to respond to anything that indicates that I don't have anything but the deepest respect and passion for the people. Excuse me. Thank you.
There's discussions being had on both sides, and I would tend to think that the honourable for St. Albert Edmonton would want to make sure that his colleague is able to answer the question without further interruption. The honourable for Yorkton Melville has 20 seconds to finish up.
And I would hope that the individuals on the other side of the floor would also show that respect to me. I am not for more division in this country. And every time we come up with these ways to say you are saying this or that divides people is shameful, and it needs to stop. This country is one country full of amazing people that want to be united. And that's what I focus on, and that's what the people in my riding are focusing on.
Resuming debate, the honourable member for Vaughan Woodbridge.
Good morning, Madame la Présidente. Good morning, everyone. Happy Friday to everyone that's gathered here this morning, to my honourable colleagues, and to the folks in the gallery as well. Welcome. Madame la Présidente, first I'll be splitting my time with the honourable member and my friend from Sudbury, who I get to sit and work with on two committees in this wonderful house. So with that, I'd like to begin on speaking to Bill C-38, an act to amend the Indian Act.
Seems to be some conversations going across the floor. Again, I would ask members, if they want to have conversations, to please take it out while someone else has the floor. A point of order, the honourable member for Edmonton Strathcona.
Madam Speaker, I tried to turn the other cheek, but the member from St. Albert has now repeatedly said things that the Speaker has already said are not allowed in this place. So I don't know if he needs to be told again. I'd like him to apologize. He said things that are frankly very untrue, and that the Speaker has already ruled are out of order in this place. He needs to apologize for those statements.
Yes.
So therefore, I certainly didn't hear what was being said there. And I would just ask, I certainly will listen to the recordings to see if we can hear what was being said, but I would just remind members, if they do not have the floor, they should not be trying to participate in the debate until the appropriate time, which is during questions and comments, or until it's their turn to have to speak on the debate itself. If they want to have conversations with other members, it's not about trying to have that conversation across the way while the proceedings are in the House. They should take it out into the lobby. I'll get back to the House if need be. The Honourable Member for Vaughan Woodbridge.
Thank you, Madame la Présidente, for your intervention there. Madame la Présidente, before I begin, it's important to acknowledge that Canada's Parliament is located on the unceded traditional lands of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. Madam Speaker, it is a pleasure to speak today on this topic and to join my honourable colleagues who are providing important information.
Conversations being had. I would just again ask members to please step out. It's very problematic for individuals who are trying to make speeches. The House actually has a little bit of an echo in here, and so when we're speaking to individuals, we don't particularly recognize that, you know, that sound does carry. The honourable member for Tims James Bay has a point of order.
Yeah, I believe the conversation is about the duty of the chair to ensure that people are not slandered or maligned. When the member was standing right beside her and accused my colleague of being a terrorist because she stands up for human rights, to accuse someone of being a terrorist in the House, Madam Speaker, you have an obligation to make sure that the member for Edmonton Strathcona's rights and dignity is not deprived by someone as low as that member over there.
Order, order. I just want to remind members, I just provided an opportunity for someone to raise a point of order, and other members were interjecting, and they were not being recognized. Again, it's about respect in the House. To answer, I just want to clarify something for the honourable member who just raised the point of order, is that unfortunately, I did not hear what was going on. All I could hear was that there was some conversations, but I didn't hear the actual conversation itself. I don't know what words were used. I indicated that I would listen to the tapes to see if we could pick something up, and if need be, I would come back to the House. I would ask all members to be respectful of each other. I know that sometimes words are being said, and I think that members recognize fully well what is acceptable and what isn't. But when the House is in progress and someone has the floor, it is not the time for other people to interject or to try to have conversations or to be yelling anything out. The honourable member for Frontenac Kingston. Lanark Frontenac Kingston has a point of order as well.
This is a perpetual challenge for all speakers, sorting out the correct order of the parts of my writing name. First of all, I agree with you that nobody should have been speaking during your last intervention, and but happy to say I was not one of those people. Just with regard to the point of order raised by the member for Timmins James Bay, he ended it by making a personal aspersion against the member. He said that the previous member, I'm not even sure which member it was, had been speaking in an unparliamentary way. That may or may not be true. I wasn't here to hear it. I do know you cannot then add, by a member as low as that one. I mean, if it's unparliamentary, it's unparliamentary. We don't have this sort of category where certain members are beneath contempt and you can say so freely as he's just done, and others are okay. That's just ridiculous, and I would encourage him to reconsider that kind of language.
Again, indicate that I actually just spoke to that and indicated that I would listen to the tape. I do want to, again, ask members to respect each other. That's what we are here as parliamentarians. It's no different than when we are out in the community. We want to make sure that people are respectful towards us and that we are respectful towards them. And so I just want to ask members to please be very judicious in the words that they use and to be respectful between each other. And as I indicated, I will listen. I will make sure that we listen to the tapes to see if the Hansard, to see if we can hear what was said. If need be, I will be back to the House to ask that member to apologize if need be. And again, the honourable member for Lanark Frontenac Kingston.
Well, my point is that at the end of his intervention, complaining about the unparliamentary behaviour of a previous member, the member for Timmins James Bay added gratuitously the comment that these are unfit comments from a member as low as that one. That, I think, is unparliamentary. I might be wrong, but I think that was an unparliamentary addition to the debate by the member from Timmins James Bay.
Which she heard.
Well, I don't know if she heard it.
I want to remind everybody to be judicious in their comments. The honourable member for Timmins James Bay is raising. I don't know if he wants to withdraw his comment.
I wasn't clear because I didn't identify the member who accused my colleague of being a terrorist in such a, and I think that is very low comment. He is the member for St. Albert, Edmonton. So I just wanted to make sure that
I would ask the honourable member just to withdraw that part about as low as that. I think that we can move forward. I think that this does not, these types of conversations are words that are being used against each other is not acceptable. It's not acceptable in the House. It's not acceptable on the outside of the House. We need to be respectful to everyone. So again, maybe I just want to ask the honourable member to withdraw that part. We can move forward, and as I indicated, I will listen to the tape, and if we can pinpoint what was said, then I will be asking that the other honourable member to withdraw his comments as well and to apologize.
Absolutely, Madam Speaker, because I respect this chamber, and this is why I'm asking you to make sure that members like him do not come in and harass and insult and threaten with language of calling someone a terrorist for doing human rights work is absolutely abominable, and I expect a standard. So I withdraw saying that he is low for doing that, but I'm appalled by his behavior.
I will, again, as I indicated, I will look at the Hansard, and we will come back to the House if need be. The honourable member, where were we? The honourable member for Vaughan Woodbridge, resuming debate.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and good happy Friday to you, Madam Speaker. It is a pleasure to speak today on this topic and enjoin my honourable colleagues, the topic being Bill C-38. Madam Speaker, again, I'll be sharing my time with the honourable member from Sudbury, as I indicated earlier, and I'll be providing an important information about the Indian Act and the amendments being proposed in Bill C-38. My colleagues have described how these amendments were developed through engagement with First Nations and Indigenous partners who represent non-status First Nations, which was central to the process. We could not do this without their collaboration and guidance. Now I'd like to share the potential impact of the amendments and some next steps in addressing the historical inequities of the registration and membership provisions of the Indian Act, and ultimately a full transition away from the Act to true self-determination and governance by First Nations. The amendments being proposed today are situated within a broader, whole-of-government effort to advance Indigenous rights to self-determination and, yes, self-government. Our government acknowledges that the Indian Act is an extension of our colonial history. These amendments are an incremental step towards the development of an approach to First Nation citizenship that is an alternative to the Indian Act. We have heard from many First Nations individuals and Indigenous partners who represent non-status First Nations that we need to address a range of issues before a full transition of jurisdiction over citizenship to First Nations can occur. That is why we are working towards today. What are we working towards today? By introducing amendments to address inequities in registration and membership under the Indian Act. So what will the impact of these amendments be, Madame la Présidente? Let me begin with the proposal to address the discrimination caused by a family history of enfranchisement. This bill would eliminate the differential treatment of those whose family histories include involuntary or voluntary enfranchisement, resulting in approximately 2,400 newly entitled individuals. It would also reinstate individuals who collectively were enfranchised as a band prior to 1985, resulting in approximately an additional 1,100 newly entitled individuals. Descendants of enfranchised individuals would be entitled to registration and would be able to exercise their rights and access the associated benefits and services, which include education and non-insured health benefits. These amendments would also recognize the acquired rights of all individuals to membership in their natal communities. The amendments provide a legal mechanism enabling women to reaffiliate with their natal bands if they wish. This would directly benefit those First Nations women and their descendants whose membership in their natal bands was changed without their consent or say. The result is that First Nations women who married First Nations men from a different community between 1876 and 1985 would have the choice to reconnect to their natal community. The bill would also return autonomy to First Nations by allowing them to deregister or remove their name from the Indian register if they wish. Individuals will have the legal capacity to exercise agency over their status. Finally, by eliminating outdated and offensive language about First Nations persons with a disability. The amendment strives to align the language of the Indian Act with the last 50 years of development in capacity and guardianship law. The outdated and offensive language in the Indian Act is a lingering affront. Addressing culturally insensitive and offensive language will positively benefit First Nations persons with disabilities and their caregivers by acknowledging their fundamental humanity and personhood instead of relegating them as defective in some manner. These amendments in Bill C-38 are considered necessary, incremental changes with an aim to align the Indian Act with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, Madam Speaker, although clearly much work remains ahead. By amending the Indian Act to support the United Nations Declaration, the amendments support the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's call to Action 43, which calls upon the federal, provincial, territorial, and municipal governments to fully adopt and implement the UN Declaration as the framework for reconciliation. The amendments also support the National Action Plan to address murdered and missing women, girls, to LGBTQIA+ people by acknowledging and recognizing the rights of Indigenous peoples. Of course, we know that the work is not complete. Reconciling the colonial legacy of Canada's relationship with First Nations while constrained to the framework of the Indian Act is fundamentally challenging. During this round of engagement, we've heard loud and clear that the second generation cutoff issue continues to impact many individuals, and our next focus must be on this issue. The unequal application of the second generation cutoff has resulted in many grandchildren and great-grandchildren being denied status and membership to a First Nations community. There are also remaining issues such as the script taking and cross-border concerns. Further conversations, Madame la Présidente, are needed with First Nations partners to listen and learn about what future changes may encompass. To this end, starting in early 2024, we will begin engagement on these additional inequities with the plan to introduce additional amendments once we've engaged broadly. Changing the Indian Act is a continuous, iterative process. We unequivocally respect the need for engagement and input from First Nations voices. Any future legislative changes will be the result of ongoing engagement and co-development of solutions with First Nations partners and other rights holders, Madam Speaker. Under Section 5 of the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, the Government of Canada must, in consultation and cooperation with Indigenous peoples, take all measures necessary to ensure that the laws of Canada are consistent with the Declaration. The amendments being introduced today are considered requisite incremental changes that both increase the Indian Act's alignment with the Declaration while also laying the groundwork for the Indian Act to be repeated in due course. The changes under discussion today are a necessary step to transition Canada out of the business of Indian registration and towards a future beyond the Indian Act. Madam Speaker, by addressing historic wrongs in cooperation with First Nations, we will continue to advance reconciliation and support a renewed relationship between Canada and Indigenous peoples. We strive towards a relationship based on rights, respect, cooperation, and partnership. Madam Speaker, I encourage all members in this almost honourable of houses to join me in supporting the bill, Bill C-38, and the step it proposes to begin to move away from the Indian Act. Megwich, Kayanamek, Marcy, thank you. Merci, Madame la Présidente. Look forward to questions and comments, Madame Speaker.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires? It's the honourable for Calgary Minderpoor.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. I think we're having some excellent discourse here in the House today regarding this very important issue. I was certainly very impressed with my colleague on this side of the House who spoke of some of her interactions and relationships, the member from Yorkton Melville, pardon me, and I was just hoping perhaps that the honourable member could share some of his interactions and relationship building with First Nations groups, which are, of course, so important at this time. Thank you very much, Madam President.
Thank you. I'm just going to get the Sergeant-at-Arms to go out again. That seems that people are filing in for question period in the lobbies, and they're having conversations, and it's easy to hear into the chamber here. The honourable member for Vaughan Woodbridge.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I just want to say good morning to the honourable member from Calgary-Mindapore. Great to see you today, as always. Madam Speaker, I will say that Bill C-38, from my understanding, is going to receive support from all sides of the House, and if I'm incorrect, then I'll be pointed out afterwards. What's important is that we continue to consult and collaborate with First Nations people, make sure we understand their concerns and the areas where we can move judiciously and with diligence forward to continue the process of reconciliation, because we know that is imperative for our government and for any government and for all peoples here in this beautiful country that we are blessed to call home. Thank you, Madame la Présidente.
Questions and comments. The Honourable Member for Drummond. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I always find it nice to see that we're finally applying some of the recommendations that were issued as part of the broader scope of reconciliation. It's unfortunate we're not further along in this process, which seems very necessary, and I can't say how much this has been anticipated by First Nations. But in terms of the application, when the committee did its study, it recommended an official apology to people who fought to end the discrimination, and there were some efforts that would have been easy to do and would have showed will to do other things rather than recognizing unceded territory which has very little value for First Nations but the proposals and suggestions that are easy to do, for example, such as apologizing, and we know that the Prime Minister is really good at apologizing when he does have to. Is this something that could be planned by the government?
The honourable member for Vaughan Woodbridge.
I'd like to thank my honourable colleague for his question. It's really important for us. I'm really happy to hear that
This bill did the requisite work and put forward a number of recommendations. It's obviously fitting that we continue to do the work that is in line with the recommendations in UNDRIP. Obviously, we can, if I understood the question, je comprends la question très bien.
If I understand the question correctly.
In terms of how we are proceeding as quickly, or maybe not as quickly, but continue to go forward in that process. In terms of the recommendations that the committee has brought forward, I'm sure in the spirit of collaboration that all those recommendations were looked at by the pertinent individuals and parties that put forward this legislation. Thank you, Madame la Speaker.
A brief question. On a le temps pour une brève question.
Time for a quick question.
Resuming debate. Reprise de débat. The honourable member for Sudbury.
Kwekwe, Udlukut, Tanzi, hello, bonjour. Madam Speaker, I would like to acknowledge before I begin that Canada's Parliament is located on the unceded traditional lands of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. I am thankful for the opportunity to say a few words today as we debate important amendments to the Indian Act, a relic of our colonial history that needs change. I would like to begin by providing a historical overview to show why these amendments are so important and why we couldn't be proposing them today without first taking time to listen to and learn from First Nations and Indigenous partners who represent non-status First Nations. Before European contact, First Nations had their own long-established methods for determining citizenship. While methods varied between nations, the issues of kinship and community ties were at the heart of these processes. But colonial administrations and then successive Canadian governments introduced a progression of statutes that drastically changed the meaning and the nature of citizenship within First Nations. The goal of these statutes was assimilation, and through the Indian Act, the process of enfranchisement was introduced. Through enfranchisement, First Nations members lost entitlement to registration and membership in their home communities. If they wanted to vote in Canada, in Canadian elections, they wanted to own land, serve in the Canadian military, marry a non-First Nations person, or deny compulsory residential school attendance for their children. This legal process not only extinguished individual rights to registration under the Indian Act, but it also eliminated the right to access a range of rights and benefits, including the ability to vote in their nation's elections. Individuals, including men, their wives, and minor children, could be enfranchised involuntarily or by application. And as I alluded to earlier, many parents sought enfranchisement simply as a means to protect their children from forced attendance at residential schools. Some were involuntarily enfranchised when they earned a degree, became a doctor, a lawyer, or professional, or if they resided outside of Canada for more than 5 years without permission. The implication of enfranchisement in these circumstances was First Nations heritage and culture was somehow incompatible with notions of modern and professional achievements. The evolution of the Indian Act had particular consequences for First Nation women. By 1869, the definition of Indian was no longer based on First Nations kinship and community, but instead on the predominance of male lineage and their community connection. Under the Indian Act, a woman who married an Indian man was automatically transferred from her father's nations to her husband's community. Women who married non-Indian men lost their status and any associated benefits completely. The result of these policies has been devastating. The final report of the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls explains how the policy played a role in limiting women's social and economic independence. We know from the National Inquiry that social and economic marginalization are among the root causes of the unspeakable violence that Indigenous women and girls endure in this country. There have been attempts over the years to do better, but these have fallen short. Amendments to the Indian Act in 1951 attempted to remove some of the offensive political, cultural, and religious restrictions, but they also gave the provinces jurisdiction over Indigenous child welfare. This paved the way for the 60s scoop, a painful process where First Nations children were removed from their families and communities instead of being provided with resources and supports. In 1985, the process of enfranchisement was eliminated from the Indian Act. Individuals who had been enfranchised by application had their entitlement restored, but they still could not pass on entitlement to their grandchildren. This is why it is so crucial for any amendments to be made in coordination with those who are most affected by them. Today, we are on a path towards reconciliation. We are trying to listen, to learn, and to do better. Policy development must reflect the recommendations and the perspectives of First Nations peoples and Indigenous partners who represent non-status First Nations. For example, through the collaborative process on Indian registration, band membership, and First Nations citizenship, First Nations partners guided the development of Bill S3, which received royal assent in 2017 and became into force in 2019, and eliminated known sex-based inequities in the registration provisions of the Indian Act. Today, because of these changes, matrimonial and paternal lines of ancestry are treated equally in entitlement to registration all the way back to 1867. Despite the successful removal of sex-based inequities in registration, the Government of Canada and First Nations agree there are still legacy issues that impact women and issues in registration and membership which remain, and they need to be addressed. In March, the Minister of Indigenous Services reaffirmed the federal government's commitment to addressing enfranchisement-related inequities in the Indian Act as soon as possible. We have been working with First Nations individuals and Indigenous partners who represent non-status First Nations to craft these amendments. We are grateful for their advice and guidance, and we recognize how difficult it can be to share your story over and over again in a struggle for change that spans decades. The amendments in the bill before us today are the result of discussions with impacted First Nations individuals, First Nations representatives, Indian registration administrators, and national Indigenous organizations, including the Assembly of First Nations, Congress of Aboriginal Peoples, Native Women's Association of Canada, Métis Nation of Canada, and the Manitoba Métis Federation. Some provided formal written feedback on the draft of the legislation, while others participated in conversations about the need and the direction of these amendments. I will now provide a brief overview of what the amendments include. The amendments being proposed will address discrimination caused by family history of enfranchisement. They will also address individual deregistration, natal band membership, and some of the outdated and offensive language in the Indian Act. They will ensure that First Nation individuals with a family history of enfranchisement will be treated equally to those without. The amendments will also allow those individuals who want to remove their name from the Indian Register the opportunity to do so. We know this is important for members of Métis groups or American tribes who wish to pursue this option based on the membership requirements of their respective groups. But we note that those are deregistered will still legally retain their entitlement to be registered under the Indian Act in the future, and subsequently transmit entitlement to their descendants. The proposed amendments would also create a legal mechanisms that would ensure that women who lost the right to membership in their natal First Nations prior to changes made in 1985 have the right to apply to have that membership restored. Lastly, we know the Indian Act includes all manner of outdated and offensive language. Today's amendments will focus on the term mentally incompetent Indians, which would be replaced with the more respectful dependent person. We recognize that there is much more work to be done to address the colonial legacies in legislation. Starting early in 2023, we will begin engagement on additional inequities that still remain in registration, including the second generation cutoff. We will plan to introduce additional amendments once we've engaged broadly. We are committed to working hand in hand with First Nations to accomplish this. We are striving to make changes based on recognition and respect for the right to self-determination. It is a learning process. We are learning how to listen and also how to act with humility. Madam Speaker, I reiterate my thanks to the First Nations individuals and Indigenous partners who represent non-status First Nations, who have devoted their time and their energy to this process of change, and to the many individuals that work hard every day to make things better for this country. Their resilience and patience paves the way for a brighter future, and I offer my deepest gratitude to them. It is my hope that this historical context and overview provides members of Parliament with a sense of why these amendments are needed. I hope all members will join me in supporting this important bill and in continuing to work towards true reconciliation. Miigwech, Kuya Namanek, merci, thank you, merci.
The honourable member will have 5 minutes of questions and comments when we retake this bill. Statements by members, déclaration de député. The honourable member of Cloverdale, Langley City.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Small businesses are the backbone of the Canadian economy, and our chambers of commerce do incredible work serving and representing member businesses. This winter, I had the opportunity to participate in 2 panels hosted by the Greater Langley Chamber of Commerce and the Cloverdale Chamber of Commerce. These local leadership panels are wonderful initiatives that connect businesses with representatives from all 3 levels of government and provides them with the chance to ask questions about government policies and other areas of concern. I'm continuously grateful for the hard work of our Chambers of Commerce in representing the businesses operating in Cloverdale, Langley City. Corey and Scott, these events wouldn't be possible without your dedication and leadership in improving our community. I want to thank my co-panelists for joining me and participating in the local leadership panels. I also want to thank the business leaders who attended these panels, as well as the organizations and institutions who support our Chambers of Commerce and make these events possible. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
The honourable member Saskatoon Grasswood.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. We honor the life of Saskatoon philanthropist Les Dubé. Les and his wife Irene have donated millions of dollars in our community for health care, for scholarships, education, research, poverty, homelessness, and most importantly, mental health. Les built his success from humble beginnings. He was the founding member of the Saskatoon Regional Economic Development Authority and served on multiple boards and committees. He holds the Saskatchewan Order of Merit and the Order of Canada. In 2013, Les was awarded the Outstanding Philanthropist of the Year for North America. The Dubés were generous supporters to all 4 hospital foundations in Saskatoon and established a number of charitable foundations bearing their name. Les is survived by his wife Irene and 3 children. We thank you.
The honourable member for St. John's East.
Speaker, more houses are going to get built in St. John's thanks to the Housing Accelerator Fund.
Hear, hear.
They are getting over $10 million that will add over 4,000 homes in the next 10 years. Incentivize rentals, allow for fourplexes, more secondary units, using city lands for affordable housing, and more. It's part of the $4 billion we're investing in housing across this country, and it's getting a large number of homes built. A lot more than the 6, not the 6,000, not the 600, but the 6 affordable units that the opposition leader built when he was housing minister. We are working with municipalities, we are changing how we build homes, and we are getting more units built.
Here, here. Good job.
Honourable member for Skeena-Bulkley Valley.
Madam Speaker, this week saw 85 young basketball teams gather in Terrace, BC for the Junior All-Native Basketball Tournament, one of the largest youth sporting events in British Columbia. I had an opportunity on Sunday evening to take in the opening ceremony, and watching hundreds of young athletes enter the gym to the sounds of the host Niska Nation's drums was a powerful sight indeed. It takes a huge amount of energy and work to pull off a tournament this big. I want to recognize the organizing committee, the host nation, the city of Terrace, the sponsors, and of course the players, coaches, family, and friends who make this event so special. Madam Speaker, young people are the future, and the cooperation and unity that I saw at this tournament shows that the future is in very good hands. I want to wish the very best of luck to all the players heading to the finals this afternoon. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
The honourable member for Ottawa Centre.
Thank you very much, Speaker, and I'm excited to rise here today to talk about building of more and more affordable housing in my community of Ottawa Centre. Thanks to our government's Housing Accelerator Fund, we are building thousands of new affordable homes across my riding today. This new historic investment of $176 million will translate into 4,400 new homes across the city of Ottawa within the next 3 years. By the end of the decade, it will mean almost new 33,000 homes in the area for our neighbors to call home. This comes on top of the $565 million our government has already spent in my community of Ottawa Centre since 2015 to build another 2,100 new homes. Speaker, we can do more. Our provincial governments, such as the Ontario's Doug Ford government, can change the planning law to allow for 4 units as of right, and I encourage all members, especially Conservatives.
The honourable member for Nepean. The honourable member for Cumberland Colchester.
Speaker, Clark, one of our last surviving veterans of the Second World War, died just a few days before his 100th birthday. In 1942, when he was 18 years old, Russell answered the call and joined the Royal Canadian Artillery. He saw the first casualties come back to England on D-Day and later served in the Netherlands until the end of the war. For the rest of his life, Russell would be an upstanding citizen, a pillar of his community, respected and appreciated by all who knew him. He was a loving husband, father, grandfather, and great-grandfather. Everyone who met Russell was struck by his decency, humility, and kindness. What was once a living memory for most of us is now rapidly passing into history. There aren't many men like Russell left anymore. Those Canadians who did their part in the fight against Nazi tyranny are one by one leaving us to take their rightful place in eternity. Men who spent the prime years of their lives far from home. I offer my best to Russell's family and the members of Royal Canadian Legion Branch 10, lest we forget.
The honourable member for Nepean.
Madam Speaker, On March 7th, the community in Barhaven woke up to the horrific and gut-wrenching news of 6 people killed, which included 4 young children and their mother and a family friend. The entire community of the city of Ottawa and beyond shared the grief and rallied to support the injured surviving father of these kids, Dhanushka Vikramasinghe, and the family of Gamini Amarakun. I would like to acknowledge the work and the support of the first responders in Ottawa. I would also like to recognize the Sinhalese Canadian community, Sri Lankan High Commission in Canada, Hilda Jayawardhan Ramaya Buddhist Monastery, and the Buddhist Congress of Canada for their hard work in supporting the families of those killed. May the soul of the deceased rest in peace. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
The honourable member for Milton.
Madam Speaker, the essential work of the United Nations protects human rights, delivers humanitarian aid, maintains international peace and security, promotes sustainable development, fights climate change, and upholds international law. Canada is a founding member of the United Nations, and our work with the UN has saved lives through peacekeeping, nuclear non-proliferation, and refugee programs. But in a display of sheer ignorance, the Conservative MP for Haldimand Norfolk not only sponsored, but apparently wrote a petition to withdraw Canada from the United Nations. Madam Speaker, this is not just reckless, but a testament to the utter disregard that the Conservatives have for global cooperation and sustainable development goals. The Conservatives have literally mainstreamed the promotion of harmful extremism and far-right conspiracy theories, and this needs to be called out. It is disinformation and it is dangerous. The Conservatives want to isolate Canada, abandon our commitments to the rest of the world, and sever our ties with the international community. They peddle a toxic narrative of nationalism and blind self-interest, oblivious to the importance of working together for a better planet. The Conservative petition has been shared and amplified by extremists, anti-LGBTQ groups, and the Proud Boys, a listed terrorist group. Madam Speaker, the Conservatives are the company they keep.
Order. Order. I want to remind members when others have the floor to please not disturb them. The honourable member Stormont Dundas, South Glengarry.
Madam Speaker, I want to add my congrats to a good friend, Wes Libby, who was recently named Cornwall's 2023 Citizen of the Year. There's a saying around home we chuckle about, everyone loves a good crier, and there's no one better at that than Wes Libby. Now, by crier, I mean town crier, which is one of the many roles Wes has held in our community over the years. The list of his community service is extensive and spans over 50 years. Kiwanis, Kinsman, Centennial Choir, Historical Society, the Community Hospital Board and its foundation, a Master Mason and Shriner, just to name a few. I've had the privilege of knowing Wes and his wife Carol for over 20 years. They are simply wonderful Canadians. Wes said of his award, "Cornwall was good to us and we like to give back." Well, Wes has certainly given a lot back to Cornwall and SD&G over the years through his leadership and volunteering. I couldn't be more proud to share his service, his story, and his award here with the House. Congratulations, and hear ye, to a good friend. Congrats, Wes.
The honourable member Pickering Uxbridge.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm sad to rise today to reflect on the recent passing of former Pickering Regional Councillor Peter Rodrigues. Peter was a colleague, but more than that, he was a true friend, and I'm devastated thinking about the fact that our last time together was in fact the final time I'd see my friend. We had some memorable council meetings together, and we knew we were in for an interesting debate when Peter started with his intervention with, to make a short story long, Peter was never lost for words, and he may have been the catalyst for the implementation of speaking time limits for councillors. I was lucky to know Peter outside of politics, and what I always remember most about him is his unmatched kindness and generosity. He was always helping someone out or volunteering in his beloved Whitevale community. Peter lived every moment with such joy. I know he wouldn't want anyone to be sad about his passing, but we've lost a fearless advocate for our community and a dear friend for so many.
The honourable member for St. Albert, Edmonton.
Madam Speaker, waste, fraud, and corruption, that's a Rive scam, and that's what you get after 8 years of this Prime Minister. 60 million taxpayers' dollars wasted and stolen. And for what? For an app that wasn't needed, that didn't work, and that caused chaos at our borders. A scandalous 76% of Arrive scam contractors did no work, including a two-person basement company that ran away with 20 million taxpayers' dollars for nothing. and now the RCMP have launched multiple criminal investigations. After overseeing all of the waste and all of the corruption, this Prime Minister has done nothing whatsoever to get taxpayers their money back. After 8 years, this Prime Minister isn't worth the cost or the corruption. Taxpayers deserve a refund, and they deserve it now.
Hear, hear, hear. The honourable member for North Okanagan Shuswap.
Madam Speaker, after 8 years of NDP Liberal inflationary spending and taxes, Canadians are struggling. The NDP, Liberals and Bloc had a chance to listen to their constituents, the 70% of Canadians who oppose the April 1st tax hike and 70% of provincial premiers who have asked the Prime Minister to stop this painful tax increase before it's too late. But they failed to hear that food banks are expecting to see 1 million more people use the facilities on top of last year's record high, and a third of food banks that will have to turn hungry Canadians away. They fail to hear that the families who have to make gut-wrenching decisions between buying food, heating their homes, or...
I'm sorry. I'm going to have the honourable member start over again. There seems to be others who are trying to make a statement or trying to join in the statement. I would just ask members to please not do that. I would ask them to wait until they are recognized by the House to be able to speak. The honourable member for North Okanagan Shuswap.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. After 8 years of NDP Liberal inflationary spending and taxes, Canadians are struggling. The NDP, Liberals and Bloc had a chance to listen to their constituents, the 70% of Canadians who oppose the April 1st tax hike and 70% of provincial premiers who have asked the Prime Minister to stop his painful increase before it's too late. But they failed to hear from the food banks that are expecting to see 1 million more people use their facilities on top of last year's record high, and a third of food banks who will have to turn hungry Canadians away. They fail to hear from the families who have to make gut-wrenching decisions between buying food, heating their homes, or other life necessities. Thanks to the NDP and Bloc, the Liberals are still set to hike the carbon tax by 23% on April 1st, driving up the cost of everything. Canadians have lost faith in this government. Only common-sense Conservatives will axe the tax and bring home lower prices for everyone.
The honourable member for Windsor-Tecumseh.
Madam Speaker, last Thursday I joined local Unifor Presidents Dave Cassidy and John Dagnolo to welcome the Prime Minister of Canada to Windsor and to our local Union Hall. Well over 100 workers and retirees welcomed the Prime Minister and heard him talk about the new partnership with Labour by delivering on our battery plant and 2,500 good-paying jobs. By delivering policies unions have long sought, like dental care, child care, pharmacare, like 10 days paid sick leave and a ban on replacement workers. Unions built the middle class, Madam Speaker, and the fight continues. The Prime Minister said thank you to the salt workers who were out on strike for 192 days, the auto workers who bargained the largest contract in history, the transit workers who defended their right of 10 days paid sick leave, the workers at Jameson and Green Shield fighting for better. A historic day at the Union Hall, Madam Speaker, a new partnership with Labour, and the best is yet to come.
The honourable member for Port Moody Coquitlam.
Madam Speaker, Canadians want greedy CEOs and mega corporations to stop profiteering off the backs of unpaid work. Yet the federal government continues to ignore this issue. Over 17,000 Canadians called on the federal government to close loopholes that allow airlines to force flight attendants to work up to 35 hours per month unpaid. And 6 million people watched as the CEO of Canada's largest airline refused to comment. Workers are being exploited by billion-dollar companies, and this government is letting it happen. At Air Canada, the CEO earned over $12 million last year, while their flight attendants struggled to pay, rent, and buy groceries. Thanks to CUPE components across this country, workers are fighting back with a campaign called Unpaid Work Won't Fly. The NDP stands with these flight attendants and is calling on this government to protect all workers and stop the exploitation by greedy CEOs.
The Honourable Member for Drummond. Madam Speaker, we hear a lot about the importance of protecting and promoting Quebec's songwriting, but it takes a lot more than words. It also takes music, of course, but also we need people who ensure to take action to protect songwriting, like Véronique Cloutier and the whole team at Rouge FM, who decided that their hit show Véronique and the Fantastiques will now become 100% francophone. Only French music during this premier drive home show. It's a really strong signal sent to the public and the competition. So I'd like to thank Véronique Cloutier. Thank you for standing up for Quebec songwriting. Thank you for supporting our creators and sending a clear message that at this time, a very difficult time for the music industry, Quebec stands with you. Thank you for proving that we can create hit shows with very diverse programming, thanks to all of our talent. Thank you, Véronique et les Fantastiques.
The honourable member for Portage-Lisgar.
Madam Speaker, do you know the most common question I get in any community that I represent? It's not, what are you going to do about this policy or that policy? It's, when can we have an election? It's because after 8 years, Canadians know that this Prime Minister is simply not worth the cost. But last night, the Liberal NDP Bloc Coalition instead abandoned their constituents and decided to prop up this historically unpopular Liberal Prime Minister in the twilight of his disastrous career. From groceries to gas to home heating and everything in between, it has all become unaffordable. So what is the solution in the minds of this costly coalition? It's to ram through a 23% carbon tax hike on April 1st. How out of touch can you be? Nobody I've talked to has said, you know what maybe the solution is? Sending more money to Ottawa. It's time for a carbon tax election so we can let Canadians decide if they can afford another carbon tax hike. Common sense Conservatives will axe the tax for everyone, on everything, and for good.
Honourable member for Mississauga, Erin Mills.
Madam Speaker, Canada's Summer Jobs is back, and we are ready to help young people gain the skills and work experience they need to succeed. Last year, through the Canada Summer Jobs, our Liberal government invested over $285 million in organizations across the country who created over 74,000 youth jobs. I can tell you firsthand the impact that this program is having in my riding of Mississauga, Erin Mills, where last year we invested in 57 local organizations and small businesses to create nearly 400 jobs for youth. I want to recognize a few of these awesome organizations who received funding last year in my riding, including the Boys and Girls Club of Peel, Ivan Franco Homes, the Mississauga Dolphins Cricket Association, and Music for Every Child, who do so much great work in the community. Thank you to all the recipient organizations and all of those who continue to invest in our youth for our future. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions and questions orales, oral questions. The honourable member, the honourable government official opposition whip.
In an act of political cowardice, the NDP and Liberals ignored 70% of Canadians and 7 out of 10 premiers last night, showing Canadians they don't care. They've abandoned the people they were elected to serve by voting to increase the carbon tax by 23% on April 1st. They're forcing families to pay higher prices for gas, groceries, and home heating. This at a time when food banks are shattering records. After 8 years, the Prime Minister isn't worth the cost. If the carbon tax is so popular, why won't he call a carbon tax election so Canadians can decide for themselves?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Environment and Climate Change and the Minister of Sport and Physical Activity.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. The Canada Carbon Rebate is possible because we put a price on pollution, and that's what's driving down the emissions in Canada, Madam Speaker. Carbon pricing is working in Canada. It is driving down our emissions, and we're doing that while sending more money back to 8 out of 10 Canadian families with the Canada Carbon Rebate, Madam Speaker. But the Conservatives want to ruin the rebate. They don't want any money to go back to Canadian families. It's very clear who they work for. It's not Canadians, it's big oil and gas. Conservative hypocrisy at its finest, Madam Speaker.
Honourable Official Opposition Whip.
Well, this government is flailing, and their climate record is failing. In BC, the federally mandated carbon tax will raise $9 billion over 3 years and credit back only $3.5 billion. I know that NDP Liberal math is hard to understand, but that is a $5.5 billion net cost to British Columbians. 70% of Canadians and 7 out of 10 premiers agree. When will the Prime Minister finally admit his carbon tax is just like him, not worth the cost, and let Canadians vote to axe the tax?
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I find it shameful that the Conservatives continue to use the affordability crisis and Canadians who are experiencing difficulty financially at home as a wedge against climate policy, Madam Speaker. There simply is not one economist in Canada who has claimed or suggested that pricing carbon is what's driving inflation. In fact, Madam Speaker, over the last couple of years, as the price of pollution has gone up, so have the rebates, and inflation has come down. That's a negative relationship, Madam Speaker. The Canada Carbon Rebate is sending more money back to 8 out of 10 Canadian families. We're addressing climate change and the affordability crisis.
The Honourable Official Opposition Whip.
Madam Speaker, what is shameful is that last year alone, this government paid consultants $21 billion, and now the RCMP is investigating them all again. Conservatives voted non-confidence and called for a carbon tax election so that British Columbians could axe the tax. The NDP leader and his member from South Okanagan, West Kootenay, voted to hike the carbon tax and keep this Prime Minister. Over 200,000 people in BC are using the food bank every month. Families are struggling, and the NDP leader and his 12 BC members are all hell-bent on hiking the tax. If he's so confident...
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Interesting that while Conservatives pretend to care about Canadians, we are actually working to implement legislation and procedures to bring down prices like food, grocery prices, internet fees. And Madam Speaker, all while we're working hard for Canadians, you know what conservative lobbyists are doing? They're creating fake, secret lobbying companies to lobby the government while hiding from Canadians that it's the same chief advisors. And what did they lobby for, Madam Speaker? Higher internet costs. The Conservatives should come clean about who they're standing up.
L'Honorable Leader Adjoint.
The Honourable Deputy Opposition House Leader. Madam Speaker, Quebecers are disappointed today. Disappointed there's no election to change this government because the Bloc voted to save this Prime Minister's career. The Bloc is bowing down to a Prime Minister who has invaded every area of Quebec jurisdiction, who's doubled the national debt, who has forced 800,000 Quebecers to line up for food banks every month. A vote for the Bloc will cost you. What did the Prime Minister promise the Bloc in order to save the Liberal government? The Honourable Minister of Public Services and Procurement. Thank you, Madam Speaker. Yes, indeed, Canadians and Quebecers are struggling to pay the bills. But what we see is that the Conservative government is against the Canada Child Benefit that has reduced child poverty by 40% in my colleagues' riding. They're against dental care, which is helping around 7,000 seniors in my colleagues' riding. So it's surprising that the Conservatives are so hypocritical. They're voting against things like the Canada Child Benefit and dental care. The Honourable Deputy Opposition House Leader. Thank you, Madam Speaker. What's hypocritical on the Liberal side is to talk about big programs and ignore what's happening at food banks and in Quebec families who can't afford their groceries every week because they don't have enough money, because the Liberal inflationary spending has increased the prices of everything. That's Liberal hypocrisy for you, Madam Speaker. And we wonder why the Bloc has decided to save this Liberal government instead of voting for our motion to hold an election over the carbon tax. What is the deal between the Bloc and the Liberals? The Honourable Minister, as I said before, there are thousands of families in my colleagues' riding who've received the Canada Child Benefit. It's about $500 a month on average, and that has reduced poverty in parents and among parents and kids in every riding. And yet the Conservatives voted against the Canada Child Benefit. The Honourable Member for Laurentides-Labelle. The federal government keeps on saying no to Quebec. This week there was There were signs of a slight openness to cooperation on immigration, but that only lasted 4 days. The minister just shut the door on cooperation in an interview with Le Devoir. No to the French language requirement for temporary workers, no to letting Quebec choose workers admitted through the International Mobility Program, and no to rapid progress on asylum seekers. Why can't this minister put aside his contempt for more than 4 days? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Madam Speaker, post-pandemic, we had increased our immigration levels and businesses wouldn't have workers they need, and our